Due process of law. Section 1, Article 3. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the laws. Section 1, Article 13. The Congress shall give the highest priority to the enactment of measures that protect and enhance the right of all the people to human dignity, reduce social, economic, and political inequalities, and remove cultural inequities by equitably diffusing wealth and political power for the common good. Due process is a guarantee against any arbitrariness on part of the government, whether committed by the legislature, the executive, or the judiciary. The Due Process Clause has to do with the reasonableness of legislation enacted in pursuance of the police power. The test or standards, as always, is reason. The police power legislation must be firmly grounded on public interest and welfare, and a reasonable relation must exist between purposes and means. Definition of due process. Due process furnishes a standard to which the governmental action should conform in order that the privation of life, liberty, or property in each appropriate case be valid. The standard is responsiveness to the supremacy of reason, obedience to the dictates of justice. It has been identified as the freedom from arbitrariness. From the case of Ermita Malate Hotel and Motel Operators Association versus City of Manila. What is the difference between constitutional due process and statutory due process? Constitutional due process protects the individual from the government and assures him of his rights in criminal, civil, or administrative proceedings. Statutory due process is found in the Labor Code, and implementing rules protects the employees from being unjustly terminated without just cause after notice and hearing. Constitutional due process, where the lack or deficiency in constitutional procedural due process voids the decision made by the state. Whereas statutory due process, where the lack or deficiency in statutory procedural due process does not void the decision of the corporation or company if the dismissal is found to have been made with just cause. It would only give rise to claims for nominal damages in the case of Agabon versus NLRC. Scope of due process is universal in application to all persons without regard to any difference in race, color, or nationality. Artificial persons are covered by the protection, but only insofar as their property is concerned. From the case of Smith, Bell, and Co. versus Natividad, the guarantee extends to aliens and includes the means of livelihood. From the case of Villegas versus Huichong. Concept of right to life, liberty, and property. Right to life. It includes the right of an individual to his body in its completeness, free from dismemberment, and extends to the use of God-given faculties which made life enjoyable. It is understood to include quality of life, which is entitlement to a life lived with assurance that the government he established and he consented to will protect the security of person means. Right to life. It is understood to include the quality of life, which is entitlement to a life lived with the assurance that the government he established and consented to will protect the security of persons. It means freedom from fear, guarantee of bodily and psychological integrity, and guarantee of protection of one's rights by the government. From the case of Secretary of National Defense versus Manalo. Right to liberty. Liberty is the right to exist and the right to be free from arbitrary personal restraint or servitude. It includes the right of the citizen to be free to use his faculties in all lawful ways. From the case of Ruby versus the Provincial Board of Mindoro. Liberty, as understood in democracies, is not license. It is liberty regulated by law. Implied in the term is restraint by law for the good of the individual and for the greater good of the peace and order of society and the general well-being. It cannot be taken away except by due process of law. Civil liberty is that measure of freedom which may be enjoyed in a civilized community, consistent with a peaceful enjoyment like freedom in others. The term cannot be dwarfed into mere freedom from physical restraint of the person citizen, but is deemed to embrace the right of man to enjoy the faculties which he has been endowed by his creature, subject only to such restraints as are necessary for the common welfare. What are the chief elements of the guarantee of right to life? Right to civil liberty. It is right to contract, right to choose one's employment, right to labor, and right to locomotion. Right to property. Property is anything that can come under the right of ownership and be the subject of contract. It represents more than the things a person owns. It enjoys the right to secure and dispose of them. From the case of Toraco versus Thompson, property and property rights can be lost through prescription. From the case of Philippine Blooming Mills Employee Organization versus Philippine Blooming Mills Corporated, a mere reasonable or rational relation between the means employed by the law and its object or purpose, that the law is neither arbitrary, nor discriminatory, nor oppressive, would suffice to validate a law which restricts or impairs property rights. Kinds of due process. Due process consists of two broad aspects, the procedural and the substantive. What is the nature of these kinds of due process? Nature of substantive due process. It requires that the law must be fair, reasonable, and just. Nature of the procedural due process. It refers to the method or manner by which a law is enforced. What is the essence of substantive due process? It is fairness and justice. What is the essence of procedural due process? It is notice and hearing. Who should comply with the substantive due process? It is the lawmakers. Who should comply with procedural due process? It is the adjudicating body or officer. Substantive due process. Substantive due process includes or inquires whether the government has sufficient justification for depriving a person of life, liberty, or property. From the case of White Light Corporation versus City of Manila, the substantive due process requires that the law itself, not merely the procedures by which the law would be enforced, is fair, reasonable, and just. It requires the intrinsic validity of the law in interfering with life, liberty, and property, and a guarantee against the exercise of arbitrary power. Requisites of substantive due process. Substantive due process of law simply means that there shall be a law prescribed in harmony with the general powers of the legislative department of the government, that these laws shall be reasonable in its operation, that it shall be enforced according to the regular methods of procedure prescribed, and that it shall be applicable alike to all citizens of the state or to all of a class. From the case of Ruby versus Provincial Board of Mindoro. Expanded test of substantive due process. 1. Is there public interest, public purpose, or public welfare involved? 2. Is the act reasonably necessary for the accomplishment of the legislature's purpose? 3. Is it not unreasonable, arbitrary, or oppressive? 4. Is there sufficient foundation or reason in connection with the manner involved, or has there been capricious use of legislative power? 5. Can the aims conceived be achieved by the means used, or is it merely an unjustified? Is it not merely an unjustified interference? From the case of Ichung versus Hernandez, substantive due process requires that the means employed in depriving persons of property must not be duly oppressive. From the case of SJS versus Atienza Jr. Lawful subject, or the interests of the public in general, as distinguished from those of a particular class, require the intervention of the state, and lawful means refers to the means employed are reasonably necessary for the accomplishment of the purpose and not duly oppressive on individuals. Due process must be a guarantee against the exercise of arbitrary power, even when the power is exercised according to proper forms and procedures. Publication of laws. Before a person may be bound by law, he must be officially and specifically informed of its contents. For the publication requirement, the law refers to all statutes, including those of local application and private laws. This does not cover internal regulations used by administrative agencies which are governed by the local government code. Publication must be full or there is none at all. From the case of Tañada versus Tovera. Procedural due process. Procedural due process refers to the procedure that the government must follow before it deprives a person of life, liberty, or property. It concerns itself with government action adhering to the established process where it makes an intrusion into the private sphere, from the case of White Light Corporation versus City of Manila. Procedural due process is the aspect of due process which serves as a restriction on the actions of judicial and quasi-judicial agencies of the government. It refers to the method or manner by which a law is enforced. What is the general rule in procedural due process? The minimum requirements of due process are notice and hearing, except however, when notice and hearing are not required in every case, for there are an admitted number of exceptions in view of the nature of the property involved or the urgency of the need to protect the general welfare from clear and present danger. The conclusive presumption bars the admission of contrary evidence as long as such presumption is based on human experience or there is rational connection between the fact proved and the fact ultimately presumed therefrom. Instances when the need for expeditious action will justify the omission of these requisites. Example, summary abatement of a nuisance per se, like a mad dog on the loose, which may be killed on sight because of the immediate danger it poses to the safety and lives of the people. Pornographic materials, contaminated meat, narcotic drugs are inherently pernicious and may be summarily destroyed. The passport of a person sought for a criminal offense may be cancelled without hearing to compel his return to the country he has fled. Filthy restaurants may be summarily padlocked in the interest of public health and bawdy houses to protect public morals. From the case of Enot versus IAC. Due process in judicial proceedings. What are the requisites of due process in civil proceedings? From the case of Banco Español versus Palanca. 1. There must be a court or tribunal clothed with judicial power to hear and determine the matter before it. 2. Jurisdiction must be lawfully acquired over the person of the defendant or the property which is the subject of the proceeding. Service of summons is not only required to give the court jurisdiction over the person of the defendant, but also affords the latter the opportunity to be heard on the claim made against him. Thus, compliance with the rules regarding the service of summons is as much an issue of due process as of jurisdiction, from the case of Sarmiento versus Raon. Third, the defendant must be given an opportunity to be heard. 4. Judgment must be rendered upon lawful hearing. And 5. No decision shall be rendered by any court without expressing therein clearly and distinctly the facts and the law on which it is based. No petition for review or motion for reconsideration of a decision of the court shall be refused due process or denied without stating the legal basis therefor. Section 14, Article 8. Take note that the Supreme Court reiterated that the right to appeal is not a natural right nor part of due process. It is merely a statutory privilege and may be exercised only in the manner and in accordance with the provisions of law. From the case of Alba versus Netoreda. The allowance or denial of motions for extension rests principally on the sound discretion of the court to which it is addressed, but such discretion must be exercised wisely and prudently with a view to substantial justice. Poverty is recognized as a sufficient ground for extending the existing period for filing. The right to appeal is part of due process law. From the case of Reyes versus CA.